Bienvenidos, bienvenidas. ¿Se escucha bien, verdad? Sí, perfecto. Yo soy David Barba, editor de La Llave. Tenemos hoy con nosotros a Don Lattin, autor de la nueva medicina psicodélica. Y os voy a presentar muy brevemente a Don y también a Maria Fàbregas, que es psiquiatra y director de la Fundación Beckley Med, que junto con Ediciones La Llave acoge este acto y junto también, por supuesto, a la Casa del Libro, que nos ha cedido muy amablemente este espacio tan bonito para la presentación. De Don se podrían decir muchísimas cosas, pero lo vamos a hacer corto. Don es periodista, ha sido profesor de periodismo también en la facultad, en la Escuela de Periodismo, algo importante, se ha dedicado a la docencia. Es muy buen comunicador. Es una persona que ha publicado en medios como el New York Times, el San Francisco Chronicle, del Wall Street Journal, en fin, algunos de los periódicos más importantes no de Estados Unidos, sino del mundo. Y es un gran divulgador, es una persona que tiene el don de la palabra también. Y ha escrito incluso algún bestseller como The Harvard Psychedelic Club y se ha dedicado a libros que están a caballo entre la religión, la espiritualidad, los psicodélicos, en fin, unos mundos cada vez menos oscuros, que cada vez están saliendo más al exterior, que cada vez están siendo más reconocidos como mundos que tienen que ver con la salud tanto física como mental, como espiritual, si me aceptáis la palabra. Y Don, además, es un investigador, digamos, muy al estilo del nuevo periodismo, incluso del periodismo gonzo. Es decir, es alguien que lo ha experimentado en sí mismo. Todo y durante muchos años, porque es un veterano experimentador y un veterano buscador de conciencia. Don ha tenido la amabilidad de venir a Barcelona a vernos, a pesar de las pandemias y de los horrores de nuestro tiempo. Aquí está, hemos podido disfrutar unos días de él, de su compañía y de la de Laura, su mujer, que está aquí con nosotros. Y en estos días también hemos estado con los miembros de la nueva Fundación Beckley Med, que es una fundación dedicada también al desarrollo de la conciencia, a los psicodélicos, a la investigación, a la formación de futuros terapeutas psicodélicos, a crear espacios de comunidad para que todo esto se pueda desarrollar, a la clínica con psicodélicos también, a la clínica porque también en la medida de lo posible va a ofrecer tratamientos. Y todo esto nos lo va a contar mucho mejor, antes de pasarle la palabra a Don, nos lo va a contar mucho mejor Josep Maria Fàbregas, el doctor Maria Fàbregas, que, como os he dicho, es el director de este proyecto, es fundador de la clínica Cita, una clínica de tratamientos de desintoxicación de sustancias adictivas, y es una persona que ha sido también un pionero en muchos sentidos en cuanto a investigación, en cuanto a divulgación de las propiedades sanadoras de los psicodélicos, en un momento en que estamos comenzando a superar la nefasta guerra contra las drogas y en un momento en que la sociedad está empezando a concienciarse, como todos sabéis, de que las drogas son mucho más que lo que nos han contado y, sobre todo, en un momento en que la conciencia del mundo parece que no anda muy fina y que, como diría Claudio Naranjo, necesitamos dinamita psíquica para poder avanzar un poco. Así que, sin más, le voy a pasar la palabra a Maria Fàbregas, pero antes de eso le voy a pedir a Don que nos diga hola. ¿Y cómo está?
Hola. I didn't hear the beginning of what he said, so I hope it was nice, but I heard the end. So thank you very much for that kind introduction.
Welcome.
No he escuchado el principio de lo que ha dicho, pero el final sí ha sido bonito, así que gracias por la presentación.
Bueno, buenas tardes, gracias por venir aquí. 4 días de fiesta y ahora el viernes han abierto ya el ocio público y, en cambio, en vez de estar bailando, estamos aquí haciendo ciencia. Muchas gracias. Un poco de contexto. Salud mental. Estamos en un momento especial. 1 de cada 4 personas, reconoce la OMS, que van a necesitar tratamiento psiquiátrico a lo largo de su vida. 7 de cada 10 adolescentes después de la COVID, presentan sintomatología que podría ser definida como patología psiquiátrica. El mundo está en un momento especial. La salud mental se ha convertido en un referente. Este año la maratón de TV3 es dedicada a las enfermedades mentales. ¿Qué hace un psiquiatra aquí? Que me presentan como director de un centro de adicciones hablando del uso y la utilización de psicodélicos. Voy a tener que explicarlo. Hay un potencial detrás de estas sustancias, evidente. La historia nos contó pues, de que en las universidades se empezó a utilizar ese tipo de sustancias, las capaces de generar conocimiento intrapsíquico, y los avances eran muy prometedores. Grof, Jensen, había un montón de investigadores que utilizaban su conocimiento para la utilización de esa capacidad. En ese momento, y esta es una de las dudas que me gustaría que Don nos aclarara, en ese momento de efervescencia en la utilización de estas sustancias, apareció el uso indebido, apareció la vulgarización en algunos casos, la utilización sin control en otros de ese potencial, y redundó esto en la Nixon y la etapa de la prohibición de las drogas y la campaña contra su utilización y sobre todo incluso su investigación. Fueron colocadas en la lista 1 de las sustancias que no tienen ningún interés, ni médico, ni ninguna, y al revés, son la lista en la que comprende todas las cosas que no hay que utilizar y no tiene ningún sentido investigar sobre ellas. Eso duró unos cuantos años de oscuridad y ha habido un resurgir. Somos todos conscientes, somos todos sensibles de que ha habido de nuevo un descubrimiento de ese potencial. En mi caso fue así. Yo trabajaba en una ONG que erradicaba la malaria en zonas remotas, en la cuenca del Amazonas, y me tocó ver y comprender pues, de que había un conocimiento ancestral y una capacidad terapéutica en unas sustancias que desconocíamos plenamente. La curiosidad fue intentar ver lo que había detrás de todo eso y lo tenía fácil porque como que ayudaba con lo de la malaria, que era un auténtico desastre. A cambio, los chamanes pues, nos permitieron conocer, entender y ver el potencial de estas sustancias. Aquí voy a explicar una anécdota que pienso que tiene mérito. En vez de llegar ahí y decir que nosotros éramos los que sabíamos, los occidentales, y los que podíamos salvar del drama de la malaria, lo que hicimos fue explicar que nosotros hemos llegado gracias a que el chamán había sido capaz de conectar con las fuerzas necesarias y hacer que nosotros llegáramos ahí. Esto lo ponía al chamán en una posición de fuerza y a cambio fueron muy generosos en explicarnos todas estas capacidades. Y trabajo en adicciones y empezamos a enviar algunos casos que entendíamos que tenían muy mala solución como última opción desesperada, el enviarlas a la selva bajo este paraguas de ese conocimiento ancestral, pues utilizar ese potencial con unos resultados espectaculares. Esto pues nos trae hoy a estar aquí y a pensar pues de que la medicina, la psiquiatría, la que yo he estudiado, muchas veces solo va hacia el síntoma. ¿Qué ocurre con nuestra manera de actuar? Corregimos síntomas. Alguien no puede dormir, le damos un hipnótico. Alguien siente ansiedad, le damos un ansiolítico. Baja su tono del humor, le damos un antidepresivo. Pero no somos capaces de ir a la causa, a la razón, al porqué, a la base de ese sufrimiento. Los psicodélicos aquí abren un paradigma enorme, un cambio absolutamente de esa manera de comprender cómo se puede sanar. Estas sustancias que antes estaban demonizadas, hoy en día sabemos que tienen una capacidad de modificar la plasticidad cerebral, para aumentar la neurogénesis. Ya hay evidencia científica sobre que la ayahuasca produce neurogénesis, nuevas neuronas con capacidad, y que los psicodélicos permiten una interconexión entre neuronas, unos nuevos circuitos que pueden realmente resolver muchos de los casos en que nosotros nos encontrábamos siempre, repito, solo trabajando con los síntomas. La ciencia ha avanzado mucho en los últimos años. Algunos ejemplos: hace 50 años uno tenía problemas de visión y llevaba unas gafas para ver de lejos y otras gafas para ver de cerca. Unos años después inventaron las gafas bifocales. Unos años después, la opción de las progresivas. Pero es que ahora alguien va a un oculista con una técnica láser y en 25 minutos le corrige un drama que antes era impensable. Ha evolucionado mucho. La neuroimagen. Hace 50 años nos hacían unas radiografías que se veía con muy poco detalle, sombras y no sé qué, y veíamos alguna parte de los huesos. Hoy en día tenemos imágenes en tiempo real de lo que sucede dentro del corazón, incluso dentro del cerebro. Todo ha avanzado mucho, menos la psiquiatría. Seguimos utilizando fármacos que el Prozac, hace 40 años que está en el mercado. Una portada del Newsweek, creo que era la semana pasada, ponía que la psilocibina, los hongos mágicos, eran una revolución terapéutica comparable a la aparición del Prozac hace 40 años. Utilizamos aún antipsicóticos de hace 60 años, el haloperidol. Ya no hablo del Valium. Hay poca innovación que realmente pueda cambiar de manera sustancial ese panorama. Pero sí lo hay. Los psicodélicos. Esa posibilidad de ir detrás de lo que uno entiende, de lo que uno conoce, de lo que uno quiere, esa capacidad para buscar circuitos nuevos, alternativos a lo que sucede, se abre un mundo de un potencial absoluto. Con limitaciones. Uno de los peligros que puede haber es creer que eso es lo que va a solucionar todos los problemas mentales. No es verdad. Pero reclamamos el derecho de investigar, de obtener evidencia y de ser capaces de formar a gente capaz, responsable, de poder utilizar ese potencial. Y ahí nació la Fundación Beckley. Partimos de una idea de un personaje curioso, Amanda Fielding, una inglesa aristócrata interesante de conocer, pionera en el uso del LSD y que ha dedicado su vida a promocionar la investigación en psicodélicos. Claudio Naranjo, un recuerdo para él, alguien que estuvo una mano en cada lado tanto de la ciencia como de ese conocimiento ancestral y que fue el que dijo: ¿por qué no sois capaces de construir un espacio para que esto quepa y poder desarrollar toda esa capacidad? Y nació la Fundación Beckley. Se apoya en 4 patas: la investigación, imprescindible para obtener evidencia científica para el uso de esas sustancias; la formación. Las universidades no tienen capacidad para dotar de conocimiento para el uso responsable, adecuado de esas sustancias. Si queréis, después profundizaremos un poco en cada una de nuestras patas. La clínica, los protocolos donde utilizar y cómo ser utilizadas estas sustancias, y la divulgación y la posibilidad de dar a conocer información que sea válida en este campo. Y hoy, la suerte de contar aquí con Don Lattin. Ha presentado un poco David, pero es un observador privilegiado, tanto de forma observacional como experiencial, de lo que son estas sustancias, su poder, y ha tenido la oportunidad, la osadía, la suerte de conocer a todos estos referentes en el uso de psicodélicos y escribirlo de una manera amena, fácil y divulgatoria todo ese conocimiento. El libro parece que se ha hecho expreso para la Fundación Beckley. Parece que lo hayamos encargado, no es verdad. Él lo escribió y nosotros lo único que hemos tenido es la gracia de encontrarlo, traducirlo al español y de tener la suerte de poderlo invitar y que nos aceptara el poder estar aquí. Pero el título no deja de encajar perfectamente en lo que estoy hablando. La nueva medicina psicodélica. Y 3 palabras debajo, tanto su uso en terapia como su aplicación en ciencia y su búsqueda en la ciencia, y otra parte que encaja en todo esto, que es la espiritualidad. Yo trabajo en una clínica que últimamente está utilizando ketamina para el tratamiento de la depresión recurrente. Y está bueno leer el libro porque él explica que la acción no es puramente farmacológica. Hay una parte que sí, la ketamina tiene capacidad para desarrollar incrementos en los neurotransmisores responsables del estado y del tono del humor, pero tiene también otra capacidad que es la de permitir este conocimiento, esta resolución de algunas dudas, esta confrontación con algunos conflictos, y en buenas manos eso es un potencial absoluto frente a situaciones que antes solo observábamos. No podíamos hacer nada más. Hoy hemos venido a hablar del libro, como decía el umbral, que decía, oiga, hemos venido aquí a hablar de mi libro. Y es verdad, tenemos esta suerte. Un libro que es un recorrido por la etapa anterior a la prohibición, con sus excesos, con sus posibilidades, la parte oscura, los pioneros que sobrevivieron saltándose incluso con riesgo legal estas limitaciones para seguir alimentando esta posibilidad, y hoy en día también pues el acompañar a algunos referentes que han sido capaces de proponer este nuevo paradigma de comprensión de la salud mental y de las soluciones en este caso. Con lo cual, pienso que lo bueno ahora es escucharlo a él, y si queréis, si nos deja la organización, si hay preguntas, tanto él en lo del libro como nosotros en lo de la Fundación, a disposición para aclarar todo eso. Le damos las gracias, le damos la bienvenida y nos disponemos a escuchar lo mucho que tiene que decir sobre esto.
Thank you so much, Mia, for setting the stage in such a wonderful, articulate way. Thank you all for coming out tonight, and muchas gracias to Casa del Libro and my new amigos at Ediciones La Llave, Beckley Med, for making this evening possible. And also big thanks to Nuria, our wonderful translator. So we are here to talk about the Spanish edition of my latest book, which has a new cover and a new title. This is the English cover and title here. La nueva medicina psicodélica, terapia, ciencia y spiritualidad. And now you can see why I need a wonderful translator. Now here's the cover, which is a variation on one of the world's most famous images, the creation of Adam by Michelangelo, which is depicted on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel at the Vatican. And this is a wonderfully appropriate image for this book. I love when David sent me the cover. I think he was a little worried I wouldn't like it, but I loved it. And one of the reasons I love it is because one of the 2 most promising drugs in the emerging world of psychedelic-assisted therapy, along with psilocybin, is MDMA. And in the United States, and perhaps in Spain, I don't know, the first nickname for this drug was not ecstasy or Molly, it was Adam. So here we have the creation of Adam. Now, that was back in the early 1980s when MDMA was still legal and being used by a growing number of psychotherapists to treat patients suffering from trauma or other psychological disorders. This was also the era when MDMA would become a notorious party drug, fueling the rave scene in Ibiza. Some of you may be in this picture, I don't know. And also in my own hometown, San Francisco, which has a long and storied history in the long, strange trip of psychedelic experimentation. The global expansion of the recreational use of MDMA led to its inclusion on a list of psychoactive drugs that were previously banned in the United States and then around the world. During the so-called war on drugs, I like to call it the war on some drugs, and not necessarily the most dangerous drugs, which is probably the longest and least successful war of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. And there were a lot of unsuccessful wars to compete with the war on drugs. Now, the drugs that were already outlawed were LSD, psilocybin mushrooms, peyote, and plant medicines, sacred plant medicines, containing the powerful psychedelic DMT, such as Ayahuasca tea. Now, this ban was based on the lie that these drugs are addictive and have no therapeutic value. And these actions, as Mia mentioned, by the Nixon administration, would not just shut down recreational use, it would shut down clinical use, which was already going on, and scientific research for more than 3 decades, from roughly 1975 to 2005. There was hardly any research done into these promising medicines. The good news is today we are emerging from the dark ages, from the psychedelic dark ages. Governments, universities, medical centers, and the general public are changing their minds about the therapeutic value of psychedelics. And that's why I titled the first English edition of the book, Changing Our Minds, Psychedelic Sacraments and the New, and the new psychotherapy. So my book is an overview of the history of psychedelic therapy. I'm trying to give context to dozens of new interviews I conducted with scientific researchers, patients, and spiritual practitioners in the United States, Europe, and South America. My approach is that of a journalist, but I don't pretend to be objective. My research was as a participant observer in the worldwide psychedelic revival, so I also write about some of my own experiences with a variety of psychedelic drugs, all taken in a therapeutic or shamanic setting. Most of my professional life was spent working as a reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle, the main morning newspaper in San Francisco, which is the city that brought the world beatniks. One of my colleagues at the Chronicle coined the term beatniks in the 50s, the 1950s. It was a play on Sputnik, the Russian, and the Beat Generation. Herb Caen, the San Francisco columnist. Human Beings, which was the first big gathering of the psychedelic tribes in San Francisco in 1966. That's an interesting event because people forget that the purpose of the Be-In-It wasn't just a party, it was to bring together the two tribes or the two camps in the counterculture of the 1960s. There were the political people that were the anti-war, the anti-Vietnam War people, the civil rights movement, and then there were the people, the more spiritual side of the counterculture, the hippies, who were tripping out and trying to change themselves within rather than change the society. And there was some debate and conflict about which should come first, changing yourself or changing society. So the human being was actually an attempt to bridge that gap and to bring these two factions of the counterculture together. And you're seeing some of the same conflicts now in this so-called psychedelic revival. San Francisco, of course, also brought us the Grateful Dead, the Esalen Institute on the Big Sur coast, south of San Francisco. A human potential movement was created there. And the psychedelic shock troops of Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters, which were immortalized in Tom Wolfe's book, The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. So there's quite a history in San Francisco for this sort of thing. For most of my time at the newspaper, I specialized in covering religion, spirituality, humanistic psychology, the counterculture, and a dizzying array of cults and sects that made headlines in America in the 1960s, 70s, and into the 80s. One of my first big stories as a young reporter was about some of the most abusive and unethical psychedelic research that was conducted in the 1950s and 60s, which we only learned about in the 1970s. And this was work sponsored by our CIA, a US Army Chemical Weapons Division, and other American spy agencies. They wanted to find out if LSD could be used, for instance, as a weapon of war, to spray on enemy troops as a kind of weapon of mass distraction rather than mass destruction. Could it be used as a truth serum or a mind control agent? There were some really horrific experiments done on American soldiers. This story was about an African-American soldier who was falsely accused of being a spy and given LSD repeatedly over a period of weeks and basically tortured and interrogated. He later won a huge lawsuit against the government after this story came out. And later in the 1980s, I wrote about the successful campaign to allow Native Americans to use peyote in their religious rituals. And these same issues are coming up now with questions around the use of ayahuasca in ayahuasca churches, and should these groups be allowed to, in the United States, for instance, to use psychedelics if it's part of their religious tradition. We have a strong tradition of religious freedom, or we do, in the United States. So some people argue that these drugs should, if this is your spiritual practice and the basis of your church or spiritual group, you should already be allowed to do this. The courts are working out some of those issues right now. So La Nueva Medicina Psychedelica is my third book in a trilogy that began in 2010 with the publication of the Harvard Psychedelic Club. This book tells the story as a group biography of 4 men who crossed paths at Harvard University at the dawn of the 1960s, including the infamous professors Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, the man who would become Ram Dass. Unfortunately, that book has not been translated into Spanish, David. Although you can find it, strangely enough, in Czech or Korean. That's the Korean cover, which I kind of like for the book. But it hasn't been published in Spanish yet, David, so you have a chance here. The second book in this trilogy is called the Distilled Spirits, Getting High Then Sober with a Famous Writer, a Forgotten Philosopher, and a Hopeless Drunk. And this is another group biography. My first book, Harvard Psychedelic Club, did fairly well, and I really enjoyed the group biography format to tell the story. So I went back a previous generation to talk about 3 men who kind of set the stage in the 1950s for what would happen in the 1960s with Leary and Alpert and all of them. And some of those men were the British writer Aldous Huxley, who's in the upper right there, a man named Gerald Heard, who you probably haven't heard of, but who was an Anglo-Irish writer and mystic, very close friend and collaborator of Huxley. He's really the guy who got Huxley interested in spirituality, philosophy, later into psychedelics. Huxley in his younger years was a pretty cynical person. And then the third person is Bill Wilson, who was the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, the 12-step group to help people with drinking problems. And Bill Wilson, way back in the 1950s, this is when LSD was still legal, saw the potential of using LSD to help die-hard drunks have the spiritual awakening that they talk about that AA members talk about in the 12-step work. And in this book, I also tell my own story of some of my past struggles with two addictive and, at least for me, dangerous drugs. Not psychedelics, but alcohol and cocaine. So that book is partly a recovery memoir, partly a group biography of those three characters. None of whom I knew, of course. They're my grandfather's generation. But let's talk about a few of the pioneers in this field, a few of the other pioneers in this field, including a Chilean-born visionary who emerged in the 1960s and whom I know some of you know and love very much. But before that, let's go back to the 1950s when LSD was still legal and seen as a promising new tool. This picture is on page 459 of the Spanish edition. It was taken in Southern California sometime in the mid to late 1950s. The tall man in the center is Aldous Huxley, the celebrated author of this dystopian novel, Brave New World, as well as his famous book about his first mescaline trip in the spring of 1953, The Doors of Perception. On the left is Gerald Heard, I just told you about, the man who first got Huxley interested in these things. Heard is mostly forgotten now, but in California in the 1950s, he was an early proponent of the use of LSD as a tool for spiritual awakening. The other man in this picture is not featured in the group biography I mentioned, but his name is Al Hubbard. He is one of the most mysterious characters in the history of psychedelics. He was a Kentucky-born Catholic mystic, a con artist, and a psychedelic evangelist. Who in the 1950s always had a suspiciously huge and endless supply of LSD. Hubbard worked with British and American intelligence agencies during the Second World War and may or may not have been a rogue CIA agent. But either way, he is the man who pretty much invented the protocol that's still used by psychedelic therapists today, including the use of eye shades, evocative music through earphones, minimal intervention from the therapist during the actual trip, preparation sessions before, integration sessions afterwards. It was really Hubbard, this shady character who, back during Prohibition of alcohol as a young man, he was working both sides. He was a bootlegger, and he was working for the federal government to arrest bootleggers. So he's a really interesting character. There's a new biography of him, which you might want to check out. There's Hubbard again. I don't know, he's wearing, looks like a police uniform. This picture was taken in Timothy Leary's house in 1979. There was a reunion of these guys from the 50s and 60s, and the other man in the picture is Humphrey Osmond. Humphrey Osmond is the British-Canadian researcher who turned on Aldous Huxley, gave Huxley mescaline on his first trip. And it was Osmond, with an assist from Huxley, who coined the term psychedelics. Before, the word was psychomimetic, which means mimics psychosis. And they thought, well, that's kind of a negative spin on what these drugs can do. They have a positive potential too. So Huxley and Osmond were trying to come up with a new word, and they would try out little poems or couplets to see how the word would be used. And Osmond came up with, "To fathom hell or soar angelic, take a pinch of psychedelic." And they decided, well, that's the word, and it stuck. So we're still talking about psychedelics today. That was in the late 1950s. In the conclusion of my new book, I write about how one of my closest friends and newspaper colleagues had a session with Al Hubbard, the guy with in the cop's uniform there, in the late 1950s in Vancouver, where Hubbard was running sessions for alcoholics and pretty much anyone else who could afford the price tag of a trip with the man known then as Dr. Always, even though he wasn't a doctor. He also was called Captain Hubbard, even though he wasn't a captain. But then, as now, one of the critical questions around the emergence of psychedelic-assisted therapy are questions of cost and supply and equity. This applies to both the underground therapy movement and the emergence of psychedelics in mainstream medicine. Hubbard left that hospital over a dispute over how much they were charging patients for psychedelic therapy, which was $1,000 in the late 1950s. And that's an issue now. Are these treatments going to be only for the elite? How are people with limited means going to be able to afford these therapies? My friend Dick, who had a session with Hubbard, was also my connection to other pioneers in the psychedelic therapy movement, including the chemist Sasha Shulgin, the therapist Leo Zeff, whom I profile in the book. And one of Shulgin and Zeff's associates in the 1960s and 70s was Claudia Naranjo, who lived for many years in Berkeley, where I went to school and lived in the 1970s. This is a picture of an icon of Sasha and Anne Shulgin, his wife, his second wife and longtime partner in psychedelic exploration of his various chemical creations. In my interview with Anne for the book, she advised young people to learn from her mistakes and be careful about taking too much MDMA and too often. She advised young adults to get a sense of themselves before they blow away their ego with high doses of classic psychedelics like LSD. And that's some advice that I could have used more than 50 years ago, and I'll tell you a little bit about that at the end of my talk. This is a picture of Rick Doblin and Leo Zeff. Leo Zeff was the so-called secret chief of the underground psychedelic therapy movement in California in the 1970s and 1980s. Rick, on the left, is the co-founder of the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, which has led the 30-year crusade to sponsor clinical trials and convince the US government to reclassify MDMA and allow its use as an above-ground psychedelic, above-ground therapeutic tool. This is a picture which David provided of Claudio Naranjo and Alan Watts. This is probably from, I don't know, the late 60s or early 70s, I'd say. Watts, one of the British metaphysical expatriates in the United States, along with Huxley and Gerald Heard, was perhaps one of that era's most articulate and amusing commentators on Eastern mysticism and psychedelic therapy. He would be very amused, I think, right now by all the money pouring into the psychedelic therapy movement, along with claims in Silicon Valley that microdosing can be used to increase worker productivity. Because back in the 60s and 70s, LSD inspired our generation to work less, not more. I mean, Watts joked that psychedelics create, quote, an attitude that is very bad for business. Serious side effects, he mused, include improvidence, lack of foresight, and the diminished sale of insurance policies and abandoned savings accounts. He also advised psychedelic explorers to get a taste of enlightenment, but not to make these drugs a steady diet. He famously said, once you get the message, hang up the phone. I briefly met Claudia Naranjo a couple times over the years, most recently, if memory serves, in 2014 at a memorial service in Berkeley for Sasha Shulgin, which I write about in the book. Claudio died 5 years later. I didn't really know him. My friend Dick knew him, actually house sat for him sometimes, so I met him a few times briefly. But I did explore Claudio's writings about MDA and MDMA from the mid-1970s when I was working on, when I first was exposed to MDA and MDMA back in the late 70s, I read Naranjo's book from that era, which is titled The Healing Journey, Psychedelic Approaches to Psychedelic Therapy. This was back, I think, maybe 74, 75, half a century ago. Right now, there's a spirited debate in the psychedelic sciences about how central mystical or religious experiences are to the goal of psychological healing in a therapeutic setting. Naranjo saw this coming back in the early 1970s when he wrote, quote, "There are those who stress the transcendental side and regard psychotherapy as a rather trivial matter, and those who look on everything mystical with suspicion. But to Claudio, the mystical and the therapeutic are just two, quote, different stages in a single journey of the soul, different levels in a continuous process of consciousness expansion, integration, and self-realization." This is a slide from an article that I recently wrote on the sort of the debate or the clash between science and mysticism in the psychedelic community right now. In the 4 years since I first published Changing Our Minds, huge investments have been made by entrepreneurs around the world hoping to establish themselves in the emerging world of psychedelic-assisted therapy. And there's a spirited debate raging today among those who favor the controlled medicalization of psychedelics and those who want to legalize psychedelics for other purposes, including for religious groups or recreational users. There's a whole campaign of people saying, "Keep psychedelics weird." That's a play on there's a town in Texas called Austin, which is the one interesting town in Texas. And people say, "Keep Austin weird." So that's a play on that. Keep psychedelics weird. So there's various camps in the so-called psychedelic community these days, and there's a lot of infighting going on. I always thought that the government or the media would kind of crack down on this, that there's been a lot of positive media coverage, and the government has been letting these clinical trials continue. But I thought, well, that'll change. The media, we love to build things up and knock it down, and there'll be scare stories and fake stories. But now I'm thinking the real threat to this is within the psychedelic community, the arguments going on within. So we'll see how that all plays out. But my position on this controversy between the scientists and the spiritualists and the fun lovers who want to keep psychedelics weird is clear. I say yes to all of the above. There's nothing like a high-dose trip on magic mushrooms, ketamine, or 5-MeO-DMT to get one wondering about this thing we call consciousness. I mean, what is it? Where is it? And why is it so hard to explain, to retain, explain, and learn from the insights that one can have on these substances? Why is it so hard once we return to our old patterns of thinking? When we transcend our skin-encapsulated egos and connect in new ways to a power greater than ourselves, what is that force we perceive? Is it God, a delusion, or something in between? Is this the higher self, the true self, or is it all just some mental projection? Is it all inside our heads, or are we tuning into some cosmic force? So in my book, I interview research subjects in the ongoing clinical trials with MDMA, sponsored by MAPS, and with psilocybin, conducted by the Hefter and Usona and now the Compass Research Institutes in the United States. Some of these patients have powerful mystical experience and others do not. The differences are driven in part by the different nature of the drugs being used and the mood disorders being treated. So the first chapter, this is a picture of a man in the center there. Chapter 1 of my book, I take a very detailed look at one MDMA session of an Iraqi war veteran who suffered for years from post-traumatic stress disorder. Nigel McCurry in the center was a Lance Corporal in the United States Marine Corps, And he was struggling with guilt from a chaotic firefight in Iraq where he accidentally fired on a truck and killed 2 little girls and had to watch their father carry their bodies away, realizing what he had done. By mistake, he thought this truck was a hostile force coming at him. And he had some other horrific experiences in Iraq. And he told me that the MDMA sessions with 2 trained therapists, he said, the way he explained it is it, quote, the MDMA prepares the brain for a healing experience. That's how he put it. He said, for the first time, this is a quote, for the first time I was able to see clearly the individual components that were working together to create PTSD. Before, it just seemed like a jumbled up mess of psychological junk that I couldn't work through. It was like the MDMA gave me an aerial view of the terrain, kind of rising outside himself to look at his brain. And I've had some similar experiences with ayahuasca, which I write about in the book, that shift in perspective. Not surprisingly, those treated with more classic hallucinogens, such as psilocybin, tend to have experiences that are better described as religious or mystical. This is another research subject in another clinical trial. Her name is Laila Thiboha. She was a subject in a study that gave longtime meditators psilocybin and then studied their brains in an MRI machine while they were tripping and also while they were meditating without drugs. And she told me that the drug-induced mysticism she experienced was reminiscent of the spiritual experiences she had during long meditation retreats, just more intense and instantly available. Quote, it's like the universe itself is a consciousness-based entity that you are tapping into, said Laila. And she was actually crying tears of joy while I was talking to her on the phone for the interview, but she was crying when she was remembering this experience in the clinical trial. She said, there is an interconnectedness to everything, an interdependence. I embodied the entire universe. I was in a swoon of gratitude, feeling love for everything that exists. We're all these threads interwoven in the same fabric that is always shifting and swimming. It was sacred, it was beautiful, it was God. Now, it's usually at this point in a talk that I read the warning label. Psychedelic drugs are not for everyone, and neither is psychedelic-assisted therapy. You may experience the interconnective ecstasy that Laila just described. You may also experience terror, paranoia, and self-centered grandiosity. You may think you have died or gone crazy. Drugs like MDMA may not be a good idea for people with heart problems. Habitual use of ecstasy is probably bad for everyone. Schizophrenics and those with a history of psychosis may want to avoid LSD. I learned from experience and discuss in the book how ketamine therapy can be an effective treatment for depression. But those of us who love getting high need to be very careful about falling into an addictive relationship with that drug. Psychedelics are not miracle drugs, as Mia pointed out. And that's why I opened this book with a quote from Sidney Cohen, another LSD researcher and psychedelic pioneer in the 1950s and early 1960s. Dr. Cohen said, quote, "A pill does not construct character, educate the emotions, or improve intelligence. It is not a spiritual labor-saving device, nor does it offer salvation, instant wisdom, or a shortcut to maturity. However, it can be an opportunity to experience oneself and the world in a new way and to learn from it." In La Nueva Medicina Psychedelica, I devote the final 3 chapters of the book to a discussion of the spiritual and therapeutic use of 2 plant medicines, Ayahuasca and Ibogaine. Again, this is a mix of memoir and reporting. I tell the story of my own experiences at an ayahuasca retreat in Brazil. And that's this picture. I'm the heavyset guy on the right there. And so I tell my experiences in Brazil with ayahuasca, and also I did some work with some underground ceremonies in the San Francisco Bay Area. I also discuss one horror story that emerged from Peru, where unscrupulous shamans have taken advantage of naive pilgrims and other psychedelic tourists. So there definitely is a dark side, a shadow side to some of this work in South America right now. This is a picture at Chimbre, which is one of the most scandalous operations down there. A young man died during an all-night ayahuasca ceremony, and they secretly buried his body and said that he wandered off, and it took his family. His family came down and discovered what actually happened, and they shut the place down. So there are some beautiful teachers everywhere, and there are some real charlatans, and it's often hard to know which is which. So I urge people caution when they go down there seeking enlightenment. The final chapter in my book is about the use of another plant medicine, Ibogaine, and the story of a retreat center in Mexico that treated heroin addicts and opioid abusers. Again, this story is a mixture of compassion and greed, a cautionary tale about how the desire to help addicts can be compromised by the desire to fill beds with high-paying private customers. One of the junkies that I profile at the Crossroads Clinic in Mexico recovered from addiction, the other relapsed. So again, not miracle drugs. So getting back to the new book cover, there's a downside to this otherwise wonderful image, which shows God handing us a pill down from heaven. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, psychedelics can transport us to heavenly realms, open us up to what Christians might call gratuitous grace. But they can also send us straight to hell, forcing us to wrestle with demons lurking in our unconscious mind. And as Claudio Naranjo notes in his book on psychedelics, there is ample potential for insight and healing in both the blissful journey and in the so-called bad trip. These are lessons to be learned. There are lessons to be learned in both the agony and the ecstasy, assuming we are prepared for the experience and have a trained guide to show us the way. Let me illustrate this point and end my talk with a personal story of some of my psychedelic adventures almost 50 years ago, around the time Claudio Naranjo published A Healing Journey. This is a picture of me in 1974, not in Berkeley, but in London. It used to be called Berkeley Street in London. I can't believe I was ever that thin, but there it is. Photographic evidence. I was 20 years old, doing undergraduate work at the University of Birmingham. Let's see. Oh, by the way, the only other time I've been to Catalonia or Barcelona was right after this, a month or two after this. I was on my winter break from college in England, and I just briefly passed through Barcelona on my way to Morocco. It was the hippie trail to Marrakesh, Don't you know we're riding on the Marrakesh Express? That song had just come out. Franco was still in power. And I was pretty clueless about the political situation in Spain. My main memory of being in Barcelona was getting caught in an anti-Franco demonstration and getting tear gassed, and the police were coming in with sirens and clubs, and I had no idea what was going on on my way to Morocco. So, but my interest in the potential of psychedelic-assisted therapy dates back to experience I had shortly before this, a few years earlier in California. This is the Big Sur coast of Central California, just a few hours down from where my wife Laura and I live. My girlfriend at the time, named Julie, and I were just starting our first year of studies at the University of California. We just met, fallen in love, and decided it would be extremely far out to drive down to Big Sur, drop some acid, and camp at a wonderful spot I discovered on a cliff overlooking the rugged coast of Central California. We arrived in the mid-afternoon and laid our sleeping bags under a small stand of Monterey pine. We looked at each other, smiled, and carefully laid 2 tiny pieces of LSD-infused blotter paper onto our tongues. Before long, we felt the first tugs of the existential anchor. The colors got brighter, the air seemed fresher and more alive. We started to notice the wonderful symmetry of nature, the interconnectedness of all things that once seemed separate. We stood on a cliff overlooking the crashing waves and the swirling tides. We found ourselves too stoned to stand up. So we laid down, and that's when we started melting together. Julia was tall and thin, more or less my height, and I curled up in a fetal position. She wrapped her arms and legs around my torso. At first, I felt like I was inside her like a unborn child. Then I was born again. We merged together. We were one being, physically, emotionally, intellectually, spiritually. There was no doubt in my naive 18-year-old heart and soul that Julie and I would be together for the rest of our lives. This was love. This is what people talked about when they talked about becoming one. This was ecstasy. This was real. Or was it? About a month later, we had another psychedelic journey. I tell the details at the afterword at Harvard Psychedelic Club, but let's just say it was the ultimate bad trip. There was no cosmic love or ecstasy. There was fear, terror, isolation, resentment. Julia and I broke up, and the profound disappointment led to what I now see as a psychotic break, which lasted for a few months. I had terrifying LSD flashbacks, which I used to think was anti-drug propaganda, but they happened to me. And I lost the ability to read a sentence, which is not a good state of mind as a first-year student at the University of California. I was convinced that I'd permanently damaged my brain and had gone completely mad. I eventually recovered, and I think I came out saner than I went in. But I wish I had had a therapist or a guide or someone to help me through that period. And it was one of the most difficult periods of my life. And it's one of the reasons I wrote this book, and why I think it's important to have guides to help us through these difficult experiences. It took me many years to realize that the ecstasy and the agony of my freshman year was not just a great acid trip followed by a bad acid trip. These were the beginnings of a long and slow process of individuation, a spiritual journey that for me continues to this day. So I thank you all for your kind attention. And I don't know, I guess we have time for some discussion or questions? Okay, well, thank you all.
Bueno, tenemos un poco de tiempo para algunas preguntas o intervenciones. Quisiera, antes que nada, dar las gracias a Núria Mestre. Como veis, es una traductora excepcional, es la mejor, sin excepción. Así que gracias, Núria. Os voy a pedir, quienes queráis aportar algo, hacer alguna pregunta, que no la hagáis directamente en inglés para que se pueda grabar. En todo caso, primero castellano y luego inglés o simplemente castellano. ¿Alguien quiere decir algo?
Gracias. ¿Dónde está el problema?
What are exactly the problems
De las propiedades terapéuticas.
for the research of the therapeutical properties of this
¿Dónde radica?
psychotropic?
Well, I think one of the problems is dealing with the medical bureaucracy of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and all the hoops you have to jump through to reschedule a drug that obviously has healing properties. It's so much easier to ban a drug than to bring it back in the United States. And the other kind of almost farcical thing that happens is the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, requires double-blind, placebo-controlled studies for psychedelics. So the research subject and the researcher are not supposed to know if the patient got a placebo or the psychedelic. Well, everyone knows that whether you got the psychedelic or the placebo. So, but because they have to use the established pattern for approving a new drug for medical use. They have to go through this, which is in some ways a farce. I mean, it's one thing to prove that these drugs can work and be effective, but anyway, so there's just a lot of energy and millions of dollars are spent in a procedure that really isn't appropriate for these particular types of drugs. So that's one of the main, I think, difficulties, and it's why it's taken MAPS 30 years and at least $30 million of privately raised money to try to bring back something that was already shown to be effective. So, yeah. And perhaps Mia, you might have thoughts on this too, of course.
Sí, yo precisamente quería transmitir a Mia Fàbregas esa misma pregunta para
I would like also to convey this same question to Maya. How is your foundation doing something to really jump the hoops, of these legal hoops?
Because also the situation in Spain, I guess the regulatory situation in Spain is of course different.
Yes, but we don't. No vamos a saltarnos las regulaciones legales.
Yes, but we are not going to jump the hoops. Spain has a regulation that allows pure substances. For instance, in the United States, to use ayahuasca, you just need to synthesize. You cannot use previous substances. In the case of psilocybin, you need to use brews that are of psilocybin, not mushrooms. In Spain, the advantage is that we can use this kind of substances. In the second place, the observational studies. Not just researchers, but also observers are needed to observe these processes. And thirdly, nowadays, the science with an ethical committee allows the use of these substances to be able to see these potentials. But it's absolutely impossible to solve. Both in the experimental subject, so the one supplying the drug and the one that takes the drug know what is going on, so this possibility of not knowing is suppressed. But now we're open. But now we have a question for you. At a certain point in your book, you talk about we going back to a situation that we already experienced. We are like going round in the wheel in the same situation, that there is an interest. How do you think we can avoid the same thing happening, the drama of the banning? What would be the instructions or guidelines so that we don't mess this possibility that we have now? Because it happened already. There were universities, there were already researchers, but the path got messed up. How can we do it the right way and successfully?
Well, some of the researchers really are recommending extreme caution in the use of these drugs in the clinical trials, because the last thing that they want is a bad outcome. And it's sort of amazing that it hasn't happened yet, or it hasn't been made public, because you have to remember that the people in the clinical trials, they are people who are very depressed, that are suicidal, that are addicts. These are people with a lot of pre-existing trouble, and so all it can take is one or two bad outcomes. Like someone may commit suicide after one of these treatments. It's not necessarily because of the treatment, it's because they were been suicidally depressed. And then I think what could happen is that could be blown out of proportion and used to shut down the research. So the researchers are being very cautious about who they select as research subjects. But as these trials get larger and larger, which they do in the final phase, I mean, dozens of different sites and hundreds of patients, you're going to have some bad outcomes. It's inevitable. And so my fear is that could be used to shut it all down, that the media could turn on it, the government could turn on it, or the media could turn on this. The media, we love to build things up and knock it down. And what happened in the 1960s was there were bogus studies, totally bogus studies about, say, LSD causing chromosome damage, which wasn't true. But that became a huge story. The people jumping out of windows, yes, that happened. So far, though, the media coverage has been very positive. And the government has let this continue. And I was expecting, like with Trump, there could be, for political reasons, they might want to shut this down. But the opposite happened. Trump wanted to let give the drug companies more freedom to bring more drugs to market in a quicker way, maybe a less safe way. So they were actually supportive of this work, the Food and Drug Administration official under Trump. And there's also politically conservative people and politically liberal people contributing to this cause. So I'm actually a little more hopeful now than I was when I first looked into this, that we're going to get through this period.
Bueno, lo primero, muchas gracias por la presentación, me ayuda mucho. Yo quería preguntarte...
First of all, thanks for the presentation. I would like to ask you about the position that's more spiritual and more scientific, What's your opinion? How do you think this evolution will go? How do you think the debate will evolve about spiritual versus scientific? The narrative, how spiritual will it be when it will be included in the clinical and in the healthcare sphere?
I think, as I mentioned, there is a debate within the research community about how seriously should we take these so-called spiritual experiences. I mean, many people in the university environment or research labs they're secularists, and they're not comfortable with mysticism and spirituality. They don't know how to understand it. So there is this tension. I mean, there were just some of the top researchers just published a paper. I wrote about it on a website called lucid.news, a psychedelic news website, warning that the researchers should downplay the mystical side of this. I think it's the kind of the mystical experience, almost a religious conversion experience that people have, radically changing their attitude about how they relate to themselves and the rest of the world, that enables these medicines to work. The mystical experience, the psychoactive experience, is not a side effect to be removed, which is what Big Pharma is trying to do that. They're trying to develop drugs that maybe work kind of like traditional antidepressants, but you won't have this powerful psychoactive or spiritual experience. So there's a fear of it. In the medical communities, I think, or a misunderstanding of it, or a suspicion of it. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
So for you, the spiritual narrative is inseparable from healing.
Yeah, and you can call it spiritual or you can call it psychological insight. It's just another way of describing the same thing. I mean, for instance, on a high dose ketamine or psilocybin trip, you may experience what a psychologist would call ego dissolution or derealization. Someone else might call that transcending to a higher self or a truer self or a higher power, or connecting to some ultimate reality, some mystical consciousness. It's the same thing. It's just a different way of describing, I think, the same change in consciousness. So I don't think we should get too hung up on it. But I think it's why these medicines work. People call them meaning-generating medicines. And I've experienced this, with, like I mentioned, I suffer from depression. And that's kind of a loss of meaning in your life. You forget how your different parts of your life fit together and have meaning. And when you can transcend the small I, the skin-encapsulated ego, often what I've experienced is it will remind me with a lot of gratitude and awe and wonder how my life fits together, how it has meaning. Is that spiritual or not? It doesn't really matter, but that's what happens, at least for me.
Gracias. I've got another question. Fàbregas has spoken before.
Yo quería saber quién está capacitado, quién debería estar capacitado para dar psicodélicos.
Should be able to offer psychedelics. Nowadays, shamans are doing it. In sort of controversial legal way. Who is qualified and what's the role of your foundation in this? Fàbregas or anybody in the foundation to be able to prescribe these drugs? I attended a meeting in Brazil some years ago in Rio Branco where the Brazilian authorities gathered all the implied people in Ayahuasca to try and approve a document with which be able to ask the Ayahuasca to exit the list, this list 1 from the Vienna Convention, and they met. They gathered 500 people in a place, representatives of all those that had to do with the Ayahuasca. And then there were shamans and pageants and everybody who with their knowledge and story and territory came there. And then another part was the new churches that were using ayahuasca as a sacrament, and they were pretty spread there. And then there was another group which were doctors and scientifics. The goal seemed easy. Okay, let's agree, have ayahuasca exit this list, and then we will be able to use it. But it was a full disaster. Shaman said, we are the ones that are depository of the knowledge. My father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather knew how to do it, and I've got the capacity to offer it because I am the one in possession of this knowledge. Then the religious people said, we are in connection with the gods, and we are the only ones able to translate that information from the gods, and we are the depository of this knowledge. And now you can imagine what doctors and psychiatrists were saying. We are not going to listen to you or to you. We are the ones, the only ones able. So it was a disaster. Till okay, they closed the door and they said, nobody exits this place until we have at least a minimum document. That was the difficulty. Who has the right of saying you can, you can't prescribe? We have done a project where with like 4 steps. 1, anybody who wants to use this substance, who wants to experiment, needs to have this minimum training. Who needs to facilitate, when in your life this knowledge can come to you. So some basic guidelines. Not just you as a user going without knowing where you go to or where you go towards. Go to somebody who has an experience, a practice, who can accompany you in these paths and in these ceremonies. 3rd level, the facilitator, the one who is responsible and who excludes or accepts and conducts and directs and protects. and offers also more knowledge about the reach and the problems and how to resolve them. And the fourth level, which would be the therapists. And nowadays, of course, there is a need of a previous training to be able to become a therapist, psychologist, doctor, and moreover, a theoretical and practical training in order to use this in the best possible conditions. The foundation has these agreements with maps and with, these institutions for the therapeutical issues, and there is a complicated part which is in the training. These students need to take in the substance. They need to consume the substance. How are you going to prescribe the substance if you have not experienced it and you don't know about it? And this fact might be a limitation, that there are ways. In Spain, and that's why we're lucky that the foundation is here and not in another country. We have a legal research here, which is the Consumers Club. Okay, it must be a non-profit origin of the substance. There must be an agreement. It's just for this use. The law allows its use. If there is a limitation, nevertheless, we can suggest a research, an experiential research under the legal umbrella of the research. But it is essential to have trained people who have the theoretical and practical knowledge, assuming the responsibility of conveying this. That's why our struggle to build this space and provide with this theory and, if possible, this practice to make this possible. It is needed. Otherwise, one day I was sent a publicity of, do you want to become a shaman? Some feathers, some drums, and pam. Now the little bottle, and who is there to say you yes, you no? So that's one of the foundation's intentions, of constitute ourselves as a serious reference, and I think medicine will be the one that will open the possibility. The ritual usage is there, the religious use is legal. Now we need this space so that the science says yes. And yesterday, with Don, we were remembering a conference in San Jose, California, organized by MAPS. I was there to explain possibilities of the psychiatric usage of ayahuasca, and I was impressed that in a huge audience there was a lot of army psychiatrists, doctors in the army that were trying to solve the drama of post-traumatic PTSD. So imagine the social cost that post-traumatic stress has in a country such as the United States or Israel. And American people have lots of advantages, but one is a huge one. They are very practical people. If this is a possibility, they accept the option of being able to open its use. When I saw this, I said, okay, yes, this is the moment. If the science and the factum powers, the governmental powers see it is beneficial, that opens up a lot of possibilities. So we think that the training needs to go that way.
In the United States, one of the big questions right now is exactly what you're saying. Who are the gatekeepers? Should there be any gatekeepers, some people would say? Should they be doctors? Should they be priests? Should they be shamans? For instance, in the just maybe the 5 years since this book was first published, 6 years this book was first published in English, there's an organization in San Francisco called the California Institute of Integral Studies, which has a psychedelic therapy training program. They've certified more than 900 psychedelic therapists. There's not really work for them right now. I mean, there's underground therapists, but they don't need certificates. And the funny thing is, some of the best therapists have no certificate. They've been working underground doing this for years. So should they be allowed? Do they have to go through a training program for something they've been doing for 20 years? Some of them are even teaching the new students, but they don't have the license. So it's a really interesting situation. And then MAPS has its own training program, probably hundreds. So I would guess a couple thousand certified psychedelic therapists have been trained for a job that doesn't really exist yet. And then there are people that question this, like Ralph Metzner, who worked with Leary and Alpert at Harvard. He was the dean of this school, California Institute for Integral Studies. He was totally against the whole medical model. He said the best, soldiers it should be like a self-help group. Like 12 soldiers should get together, take ayahuasca, and talk about this themselves. They don't need a therapist. Now, they know what they went through in the war. So there are other models. There are other models. And it's not, on the other hand, it's not either or. It's sort of like with medical marijuana or legal marijuana. You still have the underground marijuana market for people that don't want to deal with the regulation of that. So I think you're still going to have an underground. You're going to have an above ground therapy scene. So it's interesting to see how it all shakes out.
Yo quería, antes la pregunta de los peligros, el porqué de la no investigación.
The question of the dangers about research, about not doing enough research on psychedelics. That's amazing. Why can't we research? Because the big pharma controls a very important part of the procedure so that nobody else can enter this thing. To legalize a medical drug costs hundreds of millions of euros. Who is going to pay for that money to legalize psilocybin that is growing in the mountains somewhere, or ayahuasca? If they cannot put a patent on that, that's a problem. No, the resources and the paths are not okay for this. But moreover, I think that a new horizon is being opened now, which is what has happened with marijuana. The cannabinoids. Cannabis has taken a legalization path absolutely different to the other drugs nowadays. In the United States, there are states where the medical use is absolutely legalized. And they've jumped over all the rules, regulations, procedures, paths, all of them jumped over. Because there was an evidence that showed that it is not needed to show that cannabis is not so entheogenic, so they managed to open a different path then, and I think that opens a possibility for psychedelics. If a big disaster does not occur, that might give us options that we didn't have before.
You also reminded me, Mia, that this also gets back to the original question of the problems with facing this emerging treatment. You have to ask yourself, who has the most to lose financially from this? Well, it's big pharma. I mean, the amount of money that they make on traditional antidepressants, I mean, that market is threatened by psychedelic therapy. So if you're looking for a villain to come in to try to subvert this, in the movie version of the story, it could be agents of big pharma, because they have a lot to lose. Antidepressants are a huge business, and a lot of people realizing that they don't work that well. And they do work for some people. But
Bueno,
Okay, so here we are. Before finishing, I would like to say something I think important, which is I wish with psychedelics it happens not the same thing than with the COVID vaccine, that it stays in the first world, so people from Palestine, Iraq, Afghan, they also have PTSD amongst many other things and many other problems, so may they also benefit from this. I didn't want to end up without saying this. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts for having come here, for your effort, for your book, for your capability to experiment, experience, and tell us about it. Thanks, Mia. Thank you, Fundación Beckley Med. And welcome, Fundación Beckley Med. Thank you, Casa del Libro, and thanks to you all for your attention and for coming.